All right. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. Great to see you all here. Thanks for coming to the conference. My name is Tom. I'm from English UK, as you can probably work out from the background, and I work to put these events on. It's great to see you all here. This is something a bit new for us. So if you can, let us know where you're joining from in the old chat box. It's always interesting to know where people are joining us from. That'd be really interesting. Okay. I have to do a quick bit of housekeeping and then I will hand over to Anne-Margaret. So just to say, again, thanks for joining and thanks to our sponsors who are a really vital part of helping us put these events on. So thanks very much to Ensley Insurance, Cambridge Assessment English, Macmillan Education, Language Cert, and Trinity College London. Without their help, we couldn't do it. So many thanks to the sponsors there. If for some reason the session drops out, which I'm sure it won't, but if it drops out, give us a minute. We will restart the session on the same links. So just hit the same links that you used to enter this session and we should be there and we'll get the session back up and running. If you have a question for Anne-Margaret, please pop questions during the session into your Q&A box. I will come back at the end and we will run through all the questions we can. So if you've got questions, please do ask them in the Q&A box and we'll tackle those at the end. I think that's about it from me. So many of you will know Anne-Margaret from previous conferences, and I'm really pleased to say that she's joining us for another session, which I'm sure will be fantastically interesting and useful. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Anne-Margaret, and I'll see you in a bit.
Thanks, Tom. I'll share my slides now. And hopefully everyone can see my slides and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Really, really happy to be part of this conference today. And lovely to see some familiar faces in the participants room. Great. So I've got just less than half an hour today to talk about how we can prepare our neurodiverse learners for exams. Now, those of you who perhaps haven't come across me before, I am an English language teacher. I'm also a dyslexia assessor and a specialist tutor for dyslexic learners. I'm also currently training to be a speech and language therapist. So it's one of the knock-on effects of COVID that I've decided to broaden my repertoire. This topic, how we prepare our learners for exams, is actually very close to my heart at the moment because I've got exams coming up on my speech and language therapy course. So I've been thinking a lot about how we prepare for exams, and particularly students who are thinking in a different way. So just to clarify, when I say neurodiverse, I mean, and my slides are not moving forward, I mean not just dyslexic, but anybody with a specific learning difference. And we know that specific learning differences very often co-occur. So students who seem dyslexic might also have some characteristics more akin to dyspraxia or ADHD. So I use the term neurodiversity or neurodiverse because it captures more people more accurately. It's difficult to put people into separate boxes. So that's why I use that term. Now, when we're preparing for exams, I mean, there are challenges that everybody experiences. Memory, you know, will we remember all of the information? Will we recall it when we need it? But neurodiverse students have particular issues with memory. Speed of processing can also be an issue for them. Dyslexic, dyspraxic type students tend to need a bit more time to process information. Your students who have ADHD, of course, might need to just slow it down a little bit and think things through. So their speed of processing may be a bit too quick. And certainly with interpreting questions, this is an issue for neurodiverse students. They often see the world in a different way. So when they see an exam question or any kind of question, they might get the wrong end of the stick and run with it in a totally different direction. And I've seen this a lot with my students, that it's not that they don't know the information, but they're just not quite in tune with what the examiner is asking for. So these are three big areas for neurodiverse learners. And of course, what we know is that stress makes everything much worse. I mean, for all of us, but for neurodiverse learners, it's like magnifying their issues. So in terms of supporting students and preparing them for exams, there are several things we can do. Speed of processing, there's not a lot we can do in terms of helping people to process more quickly, or, you know, with ADHD students to get them to slow it down. But we can work out what kind of access arrangements will support them. I'm going to talk more about that. In terms of memory, of course, we can help them develop memory strategies. We can talk through revision techniques with them. And that's something practical and concrete that we can do. In terms of interpreting questions, yes, we can help them train so that they understand the questions a bit better. But a lot of it comes down to exam technique, looking for keywords. And I'll talk more about exam technique as well in this session. And managing stress. Yes, we can help them manage the stress through self-care. Now, this session is rather limited in time, so I'm going to focus on the exam arrangements and the exam technique, because I'm sure there are other sessions in this conference that are dealing with exams in different ways, and they may well touch on memory strategies and revision techniques and so on. But I want to focus on things which are kind of specific for neurodiverse learners. So access arrangements is definitely the key thing, and then exam technique in terms of, yeah, how do we manage that? So my way of thinking is that as soon as we get a student enrolled for an exam, so exam entry, there are certain things that we need to be putting in place. The first thing is exam access arrangements, if that's possible, if that's appropriate. And we need to start early with that. As soon as students are enrolled on their exam, we need to be getting on with that. We do need to work on memory strategies. We need to help them understand the exam, so they become really familiar with the format of the exam, and for them to be able to visualize what they're going to be doing in the exam. We can help them with revision technique, and we can certainly help with self-care, you know, sort of relaxation techniques, making sure that they practice good sleep habits and eat properly, all these kinds of things we can work on. But the first thing is access arrangements. As I said, it's something we need to start really early. And one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is, so what is available? Now, I'm sure most of you have come across the idea of extra time for students with dyslexia or dyspraxia or another specific learning difference. And that seems to be the kind of default position that we get extra time for our students. It's usually 25%. Nobody knows where that figure's come from. It's completely arbitrary. Many, many years ago, this was deemed to be the right amount of extra time. I have, on occasion, asked for 50% extra time for some learners. You have to justify it quite rigorously. You have to have a sympathetic assessor. So when I've done the assessment, sometimes I have asked for 50% extra time, but the default position is 25% extra time. So it's a 50-minute extra, 15 minutes extra on an hour exam. But extra time isn't right for everybody. I mean, I've had students who could have sat there all day and it wouldn't have helped them. You know, it's not the panacea for everybody. Some students would be better with rest breaks, which is where they can actually stop the clock and they can go off and they can have a little break. They can walk around, they can stretch, they can, you know, refocus and come back to the exam. And that's very helpful for students, particularly with ADHD, for example. I had a student who had narcolepsy, and we had to apply for rest breaks because she could fall asleep at any moment. And then we had to watch, and if she seemed to be asleep, we had to stop the clock and wait for her to wake up. That was an epic exam. The invigilation took quite a lot of time. Things like rest breaks, you would need to have a separate room because, you know, we don't know how long the student is going to be there, and if they're going to be stopping the clock and having a move around, a stretch, they're going to need a separate room to do that in. Some students would benefit from a separate room anyway. Students who are easily distracted would benefit from a separate room. Students who are using technology might need a separate room. Now, I know that can be a bit of a pain for some exam centres to put that in place, but that might be the student's best shot, actually, of getting through the exam. Some students will also require a paper that's been formatted in a slightly different way, maybe printed onto coloured paper, or maybe with a different font or a different size of font, a different layout, one question per page, something like that. And that's something that exam boards should be able to discuss with you to find out what your student would need. Use of computers becoming more and more common, and for many students this is their normal way of working, and this is a key phrase. If it becomes their normal way of working, you can apply for it to be the way they do the exam. So if they habitually use a word processor to type their answers, that could be a reasonable adjustment for an exam. Or to use a spell checker, or the read aloud facility. There's been quite a lot of interesting research done on the read aloud facility, showing that for students who are neurodiverse, the read aloud facility, that's when they hear the text as well as read it on the screen, it levels the playing field. Judith Kormosh and her colleagues at Lancaster University have done some research on this if you're interested. It's really interesting how it evens everything out. So read aloud could be a good option for some exams. Now I have to say, it depends on the exam. If it is a reading exam, it may be that the certificate then would have to be, what do they say, amended in some way, or have some kind of endorsement on it to show that the student, passed the exam with the use of the read aloud facility. So we have to think about what the test is actually testing, whether it's going to be appropriate or not. And that's true if we have human support as well. Some students will want a scribe or a reader, depending on what level they're working at. But again, if they're having a scribe for a writing exam, probably the certificate would be endorsed. It all comes down to what is the purpose of the exam, and the people who are going to receive the certificate, so whether it's a university or an employer, what is it that they're looking for, and whether they would be put off by an endorsed certificate, or whether it's just about the student actually passing the exam. If it's for their personal satisfaction and their personal development, self-esteem could be very much enhanced by giving them human support. So that's the first thing, thinking about what's available. The next thing is, how do we apply? And this is something that teachers very often ask me about. How do we put these in place? So the first thing is to find out what's needed and why. You might have students come to you and say they've always had extra time in their exams, but it's worth digging to find out why they've had extra time, because it may not be the extra time that they need. It may be that if they had a paper that was formatted in a more accessible way, then they wouldn't spend so long reading, and they could actually do the exam in the same time. So it's worth finding out what students would like, why they think that would be the best thing for them, offering them other options to see if that might be appropriate as well. Then you need the evidence. And for most sort of high stakes exams, if you're preparing students for IELTS or for international GCSE or any kind of international standardized test, you're going to need evidence to show that the student does have a genuine need in terms of a specific learning difference or any other disability, but I'm focused on neurodiversity at the moment. So you need to contact the exam board and let them know this is the evidence, this is the reason why, and what exactly you're asking for. And you need to be really clear. There's usually somebody at each exam board who is responsible for putting these access arrangements in place. So find out who that is, make them your best friend, and tell them what you want and why, and show them the evidence. And keep pushing. Very often, exam boards are kind of a bit taken aback, and they have a fairly conservative view of what we normally do. And if it's something that they don't normally do, they might just say, oh, we don't normally do that. Ask them why, and tell them why you're asking for example, rest breaks instead of extra time. Keep pushing, don't let them go. And I know this sounds a bit sort of bullshit, really. But the thing is that big organizations take a while to change. We know that. But the more of us who keep asking, the more teachers and assessors, school owners who keep asking, the more likely the exam boards are to listen, because they'll realize that it is actually a genuine widespread need. So don't give up, keep asking, and keep explaining why you need rest breaks, not extra time. How do we get the evidence? This is a big question. Well, sometimes students come with evidence from their home country. Not often, and it will depend on the context in which you're teaching. If you're teaching in an international school, it may well be that they've got evidence already from an English-speaking country. If the evidence is not in English and you're applying to an English-speaking board, like the English-speaking board, for example, or Cambridge, Trinity, City and Guilds, you will need to get that evidence translated and certified. That can be a bit of a faff, to be honest. That's why I say you need to start early. As soon as you enter the student for the exam, you need to get that evidence in place. Sometimes it can seem easier. If you're in the UK and the student is from another country, it can seem easier actually just to get an assessment done in the UK. It can seem easier. I'm afraid that some of my colleagues in the assessment industry are quite reticent to assess multilingual students and to assess students whose English isn't at a really, really high level. And I understand why, because the standardized tools that we have are not really set up for that. So my advice would be, make a start. As a teacher, you can make a start on gathering that evidence in order to persuade an assessor to take on the job. You can use the CAML. The CAML is the Cognitive Assessments for Multilingual Learners, and it's something that I put together almost 10 years ago now, because I was in this exact situation that I needed to demonstrate that my students had a specific learning difference, and my standardized tools just weren't, they couldn't do it. So the cognitive assessments for multilingual learners are designed for language learners. They're not standardized, but they give you qualitative information about memory, speed of processing, phonological awareness, literacy development, all the background information, so that you can take that and persuade an assessor to take on the assessment, basically. If you go to them and say, look what they do in their memory tests when English isn't in the equation, look how slowly they process in their own language. If you can demonstrate that, you're more likely to get an assessor to accept the job. So make a start with the CAML. Moving on to exam technique. Once you've got those exam access arrangements in place, the students need to know what they have and how to make the most of them. So many students come to me and they say, oh yeah, I think I've got some extra time, but I'm not sure how much or what to do with it. Really, really important that they know how much time they have. What will they do with that extra time? If they've got a rest break, when can they take it? They need to be self-aware enough to understand, to feel when it's time for them to take a break. How will they use the read aloud facility? Do they know how to use technology? They need to practice with any human supporters that they have so that they can communicate well with them, and so that both the student and the human support know what the boundaries are. Because if you've got a scribe, you can't ask the scribe, so the scribe can't sort of question the answer that they're writing down. They can't sort of correct the grammar or anything like that. So both the student and the human support need to be really clear about what the roles are and how they will communicate. So that's the first thing that we need to get straight. In terms of timing, students need to know how much time they have, including any extra time. So you might need to do the calculation for them. And then they need to know, in terms of the exam that they're taking, how will they allocate it to the different questions, however many questions they have. And this stands for all students, but particularly for neurodiverse students. They need to invest the first 5 minutes looking through the paper to see what the questions are. They really do. And so many students say to me, oh, no, I just get straight in, I just want to get started. No, read all the questions. And if they're reluctant, you can share this anecdote with them. So I mentioned that I'm training to be a speech and language therapist. I got exams in 2 weeks' time. Last week we had a mock. And so the first thing I did, of course, was to read through all the paper, all the questions on the paper. Quite near the bottom, there was a diagram, and we had to say what the diagram was, and then we had to answer some more questions about it. I looked at the diagram, I was like, I'm not really sure. I don't know. I carried on reading, and the questions were all about motor neurons, and I was like, okay, so that diagram is a motor neuron. So that's 1 point that I've got, because now I know what that diagram is. It's really worth reading through the questions, because some of the vocabulary that's in the later questions might just trigger their thoughts, just might make them think in the same way as the examiner. Just activate their schemata basically for exam language. So it's really worth doing that. And you need to train them to leave a few minutes at the end for checking. And that's really important, because students sometimes, you know, in the first flush of enthusiasm, they start writing. But when they go back, they might notice that they've missed out words, or you know, they might notice that they've misspelled or whatever. So leaving a few minutes for checking is really important. And then there's cherry picking. I had a student a few years ago, very, very bright girl, but she was aware that exams were not her forte. So what she used to do was to go through the paper and pick out the questions that were best for her. And she was world class at this. She knew exactly which questions she would be best suited to answering. She would choose the easiest or the ones that were best for her, and she would answer them first. And she used to say to me, you know, once I've done one question, I've got those marks in the bank. Whatever else happens in the exam, I've got those marks. And it gave her a sense of security. It gave her a bit more confidence. And so that was her starting point. I think this is really sensible, actually. Get some marks in the bank by picking an easy question to start with. It doesn't have to be the first one, because if you've read through the paper, you know which questions you can answer. And if you look at the mark scheme, you'll know how many marks you're getting. And neurodiverse students do have a tendency to give a lot of information which is not necessarily relevant, or conversely, to not give the information that is relevant. So if they look at the mark scheme and they know they're only getting 1 mark for this question, then they know they have to keep it concise, just one piece of information. But if there's a question that's got 10 marks, then they need to elaborate a bit more. So that can be a really helpful guide for them in terms of how much they need to give. And then the self-prompting. And this is something that my students do a lot as well. If they've memorized a diagram or a mnemonic to help them with, for example, I don't know, subordinating conjunctions, the first thing they should do when they get into the exam is actually write that down. So they've got that on a scrap piece of paper to support their memory, so that they're not struggling when they're actually in the thick of the question. They're not struggling to think of other things. They've got that prompt there. And remind them of all the little memory tricks that you've taught them, you know, little songs, little rhymes that they've learned to remember the vocabulary or the information that they need. And they can draw on that in the exam, but you might need to remind them that they know it. So it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, that. But my hope is that from the day of exam entry, we start to put the access arrangements in place. We obviously work on memory. We show students how to tackle the exam. We help them with revision techniques that they can take into the exam with them. We do need to talk about self-care. But by the end of this process, when we get to exam day, those students should be ready, and they should be feeling, I want to say confident. I don't think anybody ever feels really confident going into an exam, but at least they should feel that they have done everything and that they know what's going to happen, and they just have to give it their best shot. So they're in a really good position psychologically to tackle that exam and to show what they've learned. 2 events that I just want to flag up. I haven't mentioned, but it is actually the case that I'm the coordinator of the Inclusive Practices and SEN SIG, which is part of IATEFL. And at the end of May, we're going to be teaming up with the Learning Technology SIG to do an afternoon session on using assistive technology, which relates to some of the things that I've been talking about today about, you know, using a screen reader and a read aloud facility. And just before the IATEFL conference, so on June the 18th, we're having a pre-conference event with the Testing, Evaluation and Assessment SIG about accessible assessments, which is exactly what we've been talking about here today. So if anything that I've said today has been of interest to you, it may be that one of those events might be a good way of following up. A couple of references there. I'm thinking that probably the slides will be going up on the English UK website, so you can have a look there. A little bit of information about teaching students. Sorry, let's go back. There's a reference there for the CAMEL, the cognitive assessments. You can get it from the ELT World website, and an activity book which has got activities about memory, so that can be quite useful for revising. Just a bit of time for any questions, if anybody's got any questions. Tom, I don't know if you've been monitoring the chat for us.
All right, hello. Yes, we have been monitoring. We do have a couple of questions, which is great. Firstly, thanks so much, Anne-Margaret. Great presentation as always, very clear. Lots of clear ideas, lots of tips. I'm sure that will be extremely useful. So onto the question. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. Okay, and we'll take questions that way. The first one is, you talked a bit about the access arrangements. Are these available for IELTS and or Cambridge exams?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. There we go.
There is a bit of a myth about this, that you can't get access arrangements for IELTS exam. You can. It's built into the Equality Act 2010.
Right.
And if anybody tells you that you can't apply for access arrangements, it's actually illegal not to give reasonable adjustments for students with an identified need. So
Right.
yes, you can.
Excellent. There we go. Excellent. Oh, I love that answer. So clear and a way forwards. Yeah, no, I'd really encourage people to take that up. Before I was in ELT, I worked in the NHS on GP surgeries. Not recommended really, but there was lots of stuff about this, which was really important about how we upgrade old facilities. And it is in law that there has to be reasonable adjustments. So go for it. Absolutely. Okay,
Yeah.
we have a follow-up question to that, related to that issue, and it's, what medical proof do they consider acceptable? So that's a question relating to both in the UK and overseas. Do you have any input on what medical proof is acceptable?
So the first thing to say is that dyslexia and other forms of neurodiversity are not medical issues. However, it depends on what form of neurodiversity you think the student has. Now, usually, the first thing that the English teachers think of is dyslexia. So you would normally find a dyslexia assessor, an educational psychologist. You could go to the British Dyslexia Association and ask them to recommend an assessor who would do a full cognitive assessment if they could be persuaded, as I said. And then you would get your report, and that would be your evidence. If it's ADHD, you would need to go to a doctor, and that would have to be a medical assessment. Autism as well would be a medical assessment. Dyspraxia would be, again, a specialist teacher assessor like myself, or an education psychologist. But you need to get a report. It would need to be in English or translated and then certified. As I say, it can be difficult to get assessors to do that. I will do assessments. I'm very happy to assess multilingual learners. I can't be everywhere at once, but do get in touch with me and I might be able to direct you to somebody who could, or go to the British Dyslexia Association and ask them. Okay,
thank you. And just to pick that out slightly, so if in this world of sort of online learning and remote students, someone would need their medical report from their country to be certified. So does that mean that there would need to be an assessment that the person who wrote the report in that country is on a register?
So what normally happens is that the report arrives in Polish, for example, and then you have to find an accredited translator to do the translation. And that translator would also need to just check that the person who did the assessment was qualified.
Okay.
So if you find a translator from that country, they normally have an idea of who would do the dyslexia assessment, for example, in that country. It might be a speech and language therapist.
Right.
Or it might be an education psychologist. But they would know, and they would be able to tell you, yes, this is a qualified person for this role.
Gotcha. So ideally that would be at the point of translation, they would also help you with the verification of the document that's being produced. Yeah. Okay. We have a couple of questions have come in about, so we've talked a bit about that sort of reasonable adjustments. Now there's a couple of questions have come in that said the exam centers often just want to give extra time. That's a sort of blanket offer. So in terms of flexible arrangements, do you have anything to say or can you illuminate us a bit on, should people chase the exam centre? Should they go higher and take it to the exam board? How might people sort of break down this issue if they feel that the only response is here's some extra time and they want something a bit different?
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends on the context. If the person, it depends on the, if the person is a teacher in the school, which is the exam centre, then they should go to the, obviously the manager and explain why they need something different. It may be that they are then told that they have to sort it out and go to the exam board.
Right.
Which
okay.
they might need to do. If it's an external candidate, I would still be going to the manager of the exam centre, I think, and explaining. And quite honestly, I mean, if the exam centre isn't willing to go any further than extra time, I might find a different exam centre.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I know it depends on everybody's situation. It's, you know, it's a case by case basis, I think. But keep pushing is my message always. Keep pushing, keep asking, don't give up.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we're running over. We'll take one more question. If you could do the 20-second answer to this, and I'm really sorry, everyone else who's asking questions, please get in touch with Anne-Margaret. I think I can say that.
I've just put my email address up, so if anybody wants to email me, please do. I'd be very happy to answer by email.
So just in your experience, Anne-Margaret, last question. For IELTS tests, listening and reading with a spelling, have you ever had the exam board agree to take this into account when scoring for dyslexic students? So you talked a bit about how exam boards approach this, perhaps in a slightly old-fashioned way, and are they changing? Is this being taken into account in your experience?
Exam boards are changing, to give them their due. And if there's anybody in the participants from exam boards, you're doing your best, I know. But as I said, big organizations take time to change. Taking into account dyslexia in terms of spelling, no, the arrangements need to be put in place before. The idea is that then everybody is on a level playing field. So any additional support that the student needs really needs to be done beforehand, because after all, these are language exams. So the students need to be able to demonstrate what they can do in terms of language. If spelling is a massive issue, then they should be able to use a spell checker in the exam. But at the point of marking, everybody should be marked the same.
Right.
So the arrangement should be before the marking. That's
right.
my belief.
Excellent. Perfect. All right. Okay. We're getting lots of thanks coming in. I'm really sorry to people asking questions. We do have to bring this to an end because we need to get the Zoom accounts ready for the rest of the day. So just to say, there's Anne-Margaret's details. Please contact her there. I'm sure that we will be seeing Anne-Margaret again at future English UK events and training. I have a hunch. And just to say from me, really, Anne-Margaret, and from the participants, thanks so much for delivering a really super useful half hour, on point, crystal clear tips, ways of going forwards, and even taking a few questions. Total pro, gold star to you for that, I think.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And as I say, this is a topic very close to my heart. So do get in touch if you've got any further questions.
Excellent. And so from that, we'll bring this session to a close. Thanks for joining, everyone. We've got a coffee break now, which there should be a link in your program. You can go and join and chat to the other participants there. If not, amuse yourself for a bit, and we will see you back for the next set of sessions. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.